It was the spring of 1945, and the Red Army colonel had seen everything. He had survived the siege of Leningrad, crossed the Dnieper under fire, and watched his division reduced to 40 men in a single afternoon at Kursk. He had fought through 4 years of the worst combat in human history, a war so vast and so merciless that entire peoples had ceased to exist inside it. He had developed, through the accumulation of that suffering, a very precise sense of what soldiers could and could not do. So when American forces linked up with his unit at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, he did not treat it as a ceremony. He treated it as an intelligence opportunity. He watched them carefully, the way they moved and the way they talked to each other. What he concluded surprised him. It was not what Soviet propaganda had prepared him to find, and it was not what he would tell his superiors. The encounter at the Elbe was the most visible symbol of a relationship that had defined the war's outcome without ever being fully acknowledged by either side. The United States and the Soviet Union had been nominal allies since June 1941, when Germany violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and drove 3 million soldiers into Soviet territory in the largest military invasion in history. Before that morning, Stalin had rejected every intelligence warning of the coming assault, including dozens of reports from his own agents, because he trusted the treaty and despised the messengers who questioned it. The price of that miscalculation was almost incomprehensible. In the first 6 months of the war against Germany, the Soviet Union lost approximately 4.5 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed before they could react. Kiev fell after a battle that produced 660,000 prisoners. The Wehrmacht advanced 600 miles into Soviet territory before the winter of 1941 finally slowed it. The Soviet Union was, by every reasonable measure, losing the war. Into this catastrophe flowed American supplies. The Lend-Lease program, signed into law by President Roosevelt in March 1941, had originally been intended to support Britain. After Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, it was extended east as well. The quantities that followed were staggering in ways that Soviet historians would spend decades either minimizing or denying. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped to the Soviet Union 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, 1.75 million tons of food, 2.6 million tons of petroleum products, 1,900 locomotives, 11,000 railway cars, 3.7 million tires, 15 million pairs of boots, and enough telephone cable to circle the Earth several times. The boots alone were not a minor logistical detail. Soviet soldiers entering the war were frequently equipped with foot wrappings called portyanki, strips of cloth wound around the feet, because leather was scarce and industrial production inadequate. American boots arrived by the shipload. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet officer who arguably contributed more to Germany's defeat than any other single commander on any side, was unambiguous about what this meant in a conversation recorded decades later. He told his interviewer that without American food supplies, we would not have been able to feed our army. He said the situation with tires was especially critical. We had no rubber at all. How could we have kept our trucks running? With American aluminum, we built our aircraft. Without American steel, we could not have produced our tanks in the required numbers. We did not have explosives or gunpowder. The Americans sent us enough to meet all our needs. Had the Americans not helped us, we could have been defeated. This was not a statement published in Soviet textbooks. It was a statement suppressed. The official Soviet narrative required that the Red Army had won the Great Patriotic War through the genius of its commanders and the sacrifice of its people, with no acknowledgement that American factories in Ohio and Michigan had been a prerequisite for that sacrifice to mean anything. The suppression was understandable from a political standpoint and catastrophically dishonest from a historical one. It shaped how Soviet officers thought about their American counterparts and created a distortion that persisted long after the war ended. The Soviet military's official attitude toward the Americans was layered and contradictory. At the ideological level, American soldiers represented a capitalist power headed toward collapse. Soviet officers had been educated in Marxist-Leninist theory that positioned capitalism as a terminal stage of development, inherently unstable and ultimately doomed. Treating the American military with genuine professional respect required a kind of cognitive dissonance that the Soviet system was not designed to accommodate. At the practical level, Soviet officers who had actually examined American equipment knew what the trucks and the boots and the aluminum had meant. They knew what American bombing and the opening of the Western Front in 1944 had done to relieve the pressure that would otherwise have been directed entirely against them. The gap between ideology and reality produced a culture where praise was dangerous and denigration was required. The truth was somewhere that neither was permitted to go. The first systematic Soviet encounter with American military methods came not on a battlefield, but in a warehouse. When Lend-Lease supplies began arriving through the port of Arkhangelsk, and later through Iran along the Persian corridor, Soviet officers were assigned to inspect and catalog the equipment. Their reports, classified and largely buried until archival access improved in the 1990s, reveal a consistent pattern of surprise, followed by analytical restraint. The American Jeep, officially the Willys MB, became the first piece of American military equipment to win genuine Soviet admiration. Soviet vehicles of comparable size and purpose were heavier, less reliable, and harder to repair in field conditions. The Jeep weighed just 2,450 pounds and could travel across terrain that stopped larger vehicles. It required minimal maintenance and could be fixed by a competent mechanic with basic tools and spare parts that fit in a canvas bag. Soviet drivers who were assigned to American Jeeps kept them. When reassignment orders came, there are documented instances of Soviet officers requesting specific Jeeps by serial number, insisting that the vehicle they had been using was mechanically superior to a replacement of the same type. This was not sentimentality. It was evidence that individual American machines had demonstrated reliability that their users trusted their lives to, and that this trust was based on accumulated experience. The American truck became an even more transformative piece of equipment. The Studebaker US-6, a six-wheel drive truck produced in Indiana, arrived in the Soviet Union in numbers that changed the nature of Soviet operational planning. More than 100,000 Studebakers reached Soviet forces during the war. Soviet industry, stretched to its limit producing tanks and aircraft, had largely abandoned truck production in favor of weapons. The Red Army that had halted the German advance at Moscow and Stalingrad was an army that moved on its feet and on rail. It was a powerful but essentially static force, capable of immense defensive sacrifices, but it was limited in its ability to exploit breakthroughs with the kind of sustained operational momentum that turns tactical victories into strategic catastrophes. Operations like Bagration in June 1944, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center, depended directly on motorized logistics that American production had made possible. Soviet armies advanced 350 miles in 5 weeks, destroying 30 German divisions and killing, wounding, or capturing 450,000 German soldiers. The operation dwarfed Overlord in scale and consequences. It was made possible, in ways that Soviet commanders understood privately, by American trucks. General Vasily Zhukov commanded the 62nd Army at Stalingrad, the force that held the city in fighting so savage and so close that veterans described days when the front line ran through individual floors of the same building. His memoirs, written under Soviet political constraints that required him to minimize the American contribution, nevertheless contain passages where his meaning is visible between the approved lines. When he describes the logistics situation in the summer of 1944, his language shifts. Suddenly, supplies are adequate. Suddenly, movement rates exceed what doctrine predicted. Suddenly, operations sustain themselves across distances that should have outrun their support. He does not attribute this to American trucks, but the timing corresponds precisely to when American Lend-Lease vehicles had reached Soviet units in quantities sufficient to transform operational capacity. The professional Soviet assessment of American soldiers themselves was more complicated and more honest in private than in public. The Red Army ran on authority that was, particularly in the early years of the war, enforced by mechanisms that had no American equivalent. Order 227, issued by Stalin in July 1942 at the lowest point of the war, was titled "Not One Step Back" and was exactly that literal. Blocking detachments were positioned behind Soviet frontline units with orders to shoot soldiers who retreated without authorization. Penal battalions, the Strafbats, were filled with officers and soldiers accused of cowardice or defeatism and sent on suicide missions as a form of redemption through blood. Commissars attached to every military unit held authority parallel to the military chain of command and reported directly to political authorities outside it. The system produced soldiers who fought with extraordinary tenacity, partly from genuine patriotism and hatred of the invader, and partly because the consequences of not fighting were lethal. Soviet officers watching American forces at the Elbe were observing something that appeared structurally impossible by their own institutional standards. American soldiers argued with their officers. They complained openly about orders they disagreed with. They expressed opinions that in the Red Army would have been considered mutinous. They ate the same food as their commanders, used the same latrines, addressed officers by first name in informal settings. The hierarchy was real, but it was not maintained through terror. Soviet observers struggled to reconcile this with the fact that these same soldiers fought effectively. The model they had been given said that soldiers required iron discipline enforced by lethal consequences. The Americans appeared to contradict the model. The explanation required ignoring evidence that was literally standing in front of them. The American approach to artillery was the area where Soviet professional respect was least ambiguous. The Red Army had developed its own devastating artillery doctrine, the deep battle concept, that envisioned massive artillery preparation breaking open defensive lines simultaneously, allowing mobile exploitation forces to pour through and destroy the enemy in depth. Soviet artillery at Kursk and Berlin demonstrated a capacity for concentrated firepower that German forces described in terms indistinguishable from American artillery. But Soviet artillery massed through sheer volume, accumulating thousands of guns. American artillery achieved similar effects through a different method. The centralized fire direction system, combined with FM radio communications that could call accurate fire within minutes, allowed American forces to concentrate artillery effect rapidly without physically concentrating the guns. American industrial output was the dimension of the alliance that Soviet officials found most politically inconvenient and militarily most significant. The scale of American production was so far beyond anything the Soviet economy could achieve. That honest acknowledgement of it would have required acknowledging that the Soviet model of industrial organization was not, in fact, superior to the capitalist one. This was ideologically inadmissible. The numbers, however, did not care about ideology. In 1944 alone, the United States produced approximately 96,000 military aircraft. Soviet production that year was around 40,000. American factories built the equivalent of the entire Soviet and German air forces simultaneously, with output to spare. American tank production over the war totaled approximately 88,000 vehicles. Soviet production was around 57,000, with an additional 13,000 received from the United States through Lend-Lease. When Soviet planners calculated the rate at which they could sustain offensive operations, the American supply pipeline was a variable that could not be removed without producing results the math of the war would not support. One Soviet general's private assessment described visiting an American supply depot in occupied Germany in late April 1945. He wrote that he had walked through rows of vehicles and equipment that stretched past the horizon. He tried to calculate how many Soviet soldiers had died producing an equivalent quantity through his country's methods. He concluded that the calculation was not one he was permitted to complete honestly. The emotional weight of the Elbe link-up derived from this gap between what the alliance actually was and what both sides were permitted to say. American and Soviet soldiers embraced at the river's edge, traded cigarettes and rations as souvenirs, attempted communication across a language barrier that required creativity and goodwill to bridge. The photographs taken that day became among the most reproduced images of the war. They showed genuine warmth. They showed men who recognized each other as soldiers, who had traveled from opposite ends of Europe toward the same center and arrived simultaneously, who understood that the thing they had both been trying to accomplish was nearly finished. The colonel who had survived Leningrad and Kursk watched this carefully. He was not naive about what the alliance meant politically or what would come after. He knew the warmth at the Elbe would have a limited shelf life and that official memory would be selective. But he also knew what he had seen in the American soldiers across the river. He had seen men who were well-fed and well-equipped and well-rested, in a way that Soviet soldiers had not been since the beginning of the war, if they ever had been. He had seen a logistics system that produced this condition through the ordinary functioning of an industrial economy that had not been invaded and bombed and starved. He had seen soldiers who had not been broken by 4 years of the kind of fighting that had left the Red Army's survivors with a particular quality of silence. The silence of men who had witnessed things that could not be spoken and had learned to carry them without speaking. He had seen soldiers who still, somehow, smiled easily. He found this more interesting and instructive than any equipment specification. The war had cost the Soviet Union approximately 27 million dead by the most careful modern estimates, a number so large that it had required decades simply to count accurately. It had cost the United States approximately 418,000 dead, a number that represented genuine national tragedy, and that was smaller than the Soviet figure by a factor of 65. The colonel understood what this disproportion meant about the nature of the alliance and about the industrial logic of modern war. A nation that could fight from a position of material abundance took casualties differently than a nation that fought from a position of desperate scarcity. American soldiers were valuable individually in a way that Soviet soldiers could not be in a system where survival required the expenditure of lives in quantities that made individual accounting impossible. He did not resent this. He was a soldier, and he understood that wars were fought with the resources available, not with the resources wished for. The Americans had won their part of the war in a manner that the Soviet system could admire technically and could not replicate structurally, because replicating it would have required admitting that the structure that made it possible was superior. The colonel crossed the river that afternoon. He shook hands with American officers and drank American whiskey from a steel cup and had his photograph taken with a soldier from Ohio who was also 26 years old. They could not speak to each other except through gesture and expression and the particular kind of recognition that soldiers extended to other soldiers who had earned it. But the colonel had formed his assessment. He kept it to himself for the rest of his life, because some truths in the system he served were more dangerous than any German bullet had ever been. But decades later, when the system finally permitted a little more honesty, officers of his generation began to speak, and what they said was consistent with what he had seen at the river. They had treated the problem of war primarily as a problem of production and logistics, of getting things to the right place in sufficient quantity that the tactical outcome was less a matter of courage than of arithmetic. They had built a military instrument that multiplied the value of each individual soldier rather than requiring individual soldiers to compensate for industrial deficits through sacrifice. They had done this while also fighting, which is the part that Soviet ideology found most inconvenient to explain, because the official theory said that capitalist soldiers could not match the motivation of socialist ones. The soldiers at the Elbe did not fit this theory. They had crossed a continent, through a different kind of war, fought with different methods, and at a different cost, and they had arrived. The colonel's name was not recorded in the documents that survive. He is visible only as a presence in the margins, a Soviet officer at the Elbe who watched carefully and said little. He represents the honest professional assessment that the Soviet military made of its American counterpart and was never fully permitted to speak. The production numbers were real. The trucks were real. The boots were real. The radio-directed artillery that responded in minutes rather than hours was real. The soldiers who had not been broken, who still smiled easily at the edge of a finished war, were real. And the gap between what the alliance actually was and what both sides were permitted to say was also real. The full accounting of it is still being made.